He called me on the phone, and he never spoke to me again. That was Joan Rivers.
A special coming up for NBC on November the 29th.
One of the most celebrated comedians in American history, describing the moment Johnny Carson erased her from his life. No confrontation. No argument. No goodbye. Just silence. Permanent, unforgiving silence. That is the kind of man Johnny Carson was.
And I said, no, Jack and I are now what you'd call close friends.
For 30 years, Johnny Carson ruled American late night with an iron fist wrapped in a cashmere blazer. Tonight, we are counting down 10 guests who crossed him and paid a devastating price they never fully recovered from. Most people remember Carson as the warm, witty host who made America feel good before bed. What they don't know is that beneath that million-dollar smile lived one of the most controlled, precise, and quietly ruthless personalities in the history of Hollywood.
And here you are.
And Milt Kamen was on the show with us that time?
Carson never raised his voice on television. He never made scenes at industry parties. He simply removed people from his show, from his life, and in some cases, from the trajectory of their entire careers. Permanently. Tonight, we are pulling back the curtain on the guests who found out what it meant to anger the king of late night, because understanding what broke these relationships tells us something profound about the price of power, loyalty, and the razor-thin line between beloved and blacklisted in the golden age of American television. But first, let's start with the moment that set the tone for everything. The guest who wasn't just banned, but erased. The guest whose departure became the defining proof that Johnny Carson's silence was the most devastating weapon in show business. Number 1, Joan Rivers.
Sit down.
Do you think you're any older?
I don't feel any older.
May 1986. Joan Rivers accepted a late-night hosting deal with the newly launched Fox network, and Johnny Carson learned about it from media reports before she ever said a word to him directly. Joan Rivers did not simply appear on The Tonight Show. She was built there. Carson had personally mentored her, championed her, and elevated her to the position of permanent guest host, the only woman ever to hold that role in the show's history. For over 2 decades, a Rivers appearance was an event. She was electric, unpredictable, brilliantly funny, and Carson trusted her with his desk.
New additions to your person.
Well, what I did, I put in what I had in 60.
She was, in every meaningful sense, the heir apparent. In 1986, Fox Broadcasting was a fledgling network desperate to establish itself in late night. Rivers was the obvious choice, a giant name, a proven draw, a woman who could headline. And Rivers, at 53, felt she had waited long enough. She wanted her own show. She wanted the chair, not the guest chair. What nobody said out loud was that accepting Fox's offer meant going to war with the man who had made her. The calls between her team and Fox went forward. Deals were struck. Announcements were prepared. And throughout all of it, one critical conversation never happened. Nobody called Johnny. Carson read about the deal in the trades. Not from Rivers. Not from her manager. From a newspaper. According to those close to him, he picked up the phone and called her exactly once. It was short. It was cold. And it was the last time he ever spoke to her voluntarily. He called me on the phone, Rivers later recalled, her voice dropping almost imperceptibly. And he never spoke to me again. Rivers was immediately and permanently banned from The Tonight Show.
That matter, Katharine Hepburn and her brother Audrey.
That's right.
Not one appearance in Carson's final 6 years on the air. The late night with Joan Rivers on Fox lasted less than a year before she was fired by the very network she had sacrificed everything to join. The wound never healed. Rivers spent the rest of her career publicly expressing regret about how it ended. Carson went to his grave without forgiving her. The feud lasted until his death in 2005, nearly 2 decades of silence from the man who had once called her the funniest woman in America. That is what Carson's anger looked like when it involved someone he had loved. Quiet. Absolute. Irreversible. But if the Rivers betrayal showed what happened when Carson felt personally abandoned, the next entry reveals something even more raw, the moment a Vegas superstar walked backstage and threatened the king of late night face to face. Number 2, Wayne Newton.
Friend of mine, and all of a sudden, a whole new...
The mid-1980s. Wayne Newton was at the peak of his Las Vegas dominance, and Carson's repeated jokes about Newton's personal life had finally pushed the entertainer past his breaking point. Wayne Newton was, by any measure, one of the most successful live entertainers in American history. Mr. Las Vegas. A man who sold out the Desert Inn and the Sands with the same reliability with which the sun rose over the Nevada desert. He was beloved, powerful, and deeply image-conscious. A performer who had spent decades cultivating a reputation as a patriot, a gentleman, and a family man. And Carson's monologue writers had apparently decided that reputation was too good to leave alone. The joke started small, the kind of offhand remarks Carson could deliver with a raised eyebrow that made the audience laugh before anyone fully processed what had been said. But over time, the jokes grew pointed. They circled Newton's masculinity, his personal life, his carefully constructed image. Night after night, millions of Americans watched Carson plant seeds of doubt about a man who could do nothing about it from a Vegas stage 250 miles away. Newton watched. Newton stewed. And then Newton decided he had heard enough. According to multiple accounts from people who worked at the show during that period, Newton appeared backstage at NBC studios and confronted Carson directly. Not through lawyers. Not through publicists. Face to face. The exchange was reportedly brief, tense, and unmistakable in its meaning. Newton made clear that the jokes about him would stop. Carson, according to those present, listened without expression. Then Newton left. Shortly afterward, the jokes stopped. So did Newton's invitations. Wayne Newton never appeared on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson again. Whether Carson respected the confrontation or simply filed Newton away in the permanent exile column depends on who you ask. What is not disputed is the result. One of the biggest entertainment names in America became a ghost on the most important talk show in the country. The moment remains one of the most talked about backstage incidents in Tonight Show history, recalled a producer who worked at 30 Rockefeller Plaza during those years. Newton walked in and demanded respect. Carson's response was to remove him entirely. But while Newton's confrontation was direct and physical, the next story is stranger. A comedian who made anger into an art form on Carson's couch, until the art became something Carson could no longer tolerate. Number 3. Charles Grodin.
All right. Being in a two-lane highway where the guy ahead drives 30 miles an hour.
Throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Grodin developed a confrontational interview persona that began playfully, and ended with his invitations quietly disappearing from the Tonight Show booking schedule altogether. Charles Grodin was a genuinely unusual television talent. Where most guests arrived on Carson's couch eager to charm, eager to perform, eager to make the host like them, Grodin did the opposite. He was deadpan where others were animated. He challenged Carson's questions, disputed his premises, and maintained an expression of barely concealed skepticism that audiences found either hilarious or exhausting depending on their tolerance for theatrical stubbornness. Carson, to his credit, played along brilliantly. The two developed what appeared to be a genuine comedic chemistry built entirely on mock antagonism. The problem with mock antagonism is that it requires both parties to remain committed to the fiction. It requires trust. And it requires a clear, unspoken agreement about where the line is. For years, Grodin walked right up to that line with the precision of a tightrope performer. He would challenge Carson, frustrate him deliberately, turn interviews into quiet battles of will, and then, just when the tension became genuine, he would release it with a perfectly timed look that collapsed the whole thing into laughter. It was extraordinary to watch. But somewhere in the mid-1980s, according to those who observed the relationship closely, the mock antagonism began feeling less like a bit and more like a personality. There was no single explosion, no thrown drink, no confrontation in a corridor. Carson's displeasure with Grodin manifested as absence. The invitations stopped arriving. Carson had a gift for making people feel like they'd never existed, recalled a booking producer from the era. He didn't fire people from the show. He just forgot to invite them. Grodin later acknowledged that his relationship with Carson had cooled significantly, though he was typically oblique about the specific reasons. The golden ticket of a Tonight Show appearance, the one that could launch a comedian into a different stratosphere overnight, was no longer available to him. The comedy had been too real, for too long, for Carson to continue finding it funny. Grodin's transgression was subtle, a slow erosion of the host's patience. But the next entry was anything but subtle. This was a Hollywood legend, an Oscar winner, a woman who had survived decades of the industry's most brutal politics. And she allegedly threw a drink at Johnny Carson on his own stage. Number 4, Shelley Winters.
He just looked at me and said, what was I in Harper, chopped liver?
The 1970s. Winters was a fixture on late-night television, and Carson's tolerance for unpredictable guests was being systematically tested. Shelley Winters was a 2-time Academy Award winner, a survivor of the Golden Age studio system, and a woman who had never in her life been particularly interested in making anyone comfortable. She was brilliant, volatile, deeply opinionated, and constitutionally incapable of giving a boring interview. Carson had welcomed her multiple times precisely because of this. A Winters appearance was guaranteed to produce television that nobody could entirely predict. She had stories. She had feuds. She had opinions about everything and everyone, delivered with the particular confidence of a woman who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. On the night in question, those present at the studio recalled that the energy was wrong from the moment she sat down. She was agitated, scattered, shifting between subjects with a frenetic quality that made the segment feel unstable. Carson, always a master of control, attempted to guide the conversation back to manageable territory. Winters did not appear to notice, or did not appear to care. The audience grew tense. The cameras kept rolling. And then the moment happened. Accounts vary in their details, as accounts of live television incidents often do, but multiple sources who were present at the taping describe Winters either splashing or throwing the contents of her glass in Carson's direction, a gesture that went far beyond any comedic intent and landed in the silence that follows a genuine social catastrophe. Carson's expression, according to those watching from the wings, was not anger in the explosive sense. It was something colder, more controlled, more permanent. The look of a man cataloging an offense for future reference. Shelley Winters was banned from The Tonight Show. No announcement was made, no statement issued, no war of words conducted through the press. She simply ceased to be a guest. In the hermetically sealed world of late-night television, where a single appearance could revive a flagging career and absence was its own kind of death sentence, this was a devastating consequence. Winters lost her access to Carson's stage in a single, chaotic moment. The next guest on our list lost something more complicated, not through drama or confrontation, but through the quiet, inexplicable process by which a favorite becomes, without anyone quite explaining why, a former favorite. Number 5, Rich Little.
You to sing one or two lines, and then some other celebrity will sing two, and we'll piece it.
The late 1970s through the 1980s. Little had transitioned from one of Carson's most frequently booked guests to a performer who stopped receiving calls from Burbank entirely. Rich Little was, at his peak, one of the most technically gifted impressionists in the world. His ability to disappear into a voice, to capture not just the sound but the rhythm, the cadence, the psychological essence of another person, was genuinely extraordinary. Carson had been an impressionist himself early in his career, and he had a deep appreciation for the craft when it was executed at the highest level. Little executed it at the highest level. He was a Tonight Show regular, a fixture, a performer Carson genuinely seemed to enjoy. For a stretch in the 1970s, it seemed like Little was on the show nearly every other week. Somewhere behind the scenes, the warmth began to cool. Those who worked at the show during the period suggest two converging problems. First, Little's impressions were beginning to feel like a known quantity. Audiences had seen every impression he did, and the element of surprise that makes a great impressionist irresistible had been worn smooth by repetition. Second, and more damaging, was the whisper campaign that developed around Little's behavior off-camera, a compulsive need to be on even when no audience was present. Rich couldn't turn it off, recalled someone who worked alongside him during that period. You'd be having a normal conversation, and suddenly you were talking to Jimmy Stewart. It was brilliant the first 50 times. After that, it just felt like being trapped. Whether Carson heard similar reports or simply grew tired of booking an act whose ceiling he had already seen is unclear. What is clear is that the bookings stopped, gradually and then completely, with a particular quietness that Carson reserved for people he was finished with. Little's television work declined significantly through the 1980s, precisely during the period when a Tonight Show endorsement would have been most valuable to his career. He has spoken in interviews about his confusion over what changed, which is itself revealing. Carson's method of exclusion was so clean, so devoid of explanation, that even the excluded often couldn't pinpoint exactly when or why it had happened. Little's disappearance was a slow fade rather than a dramatic exit. But the next story involves a man whose relationship with Carson began as genuine admiration and transformed, through ego, rivalry, and the particular toxicity of two powerful entertainers sharing the same medium, into something neither of them ever fully resolved. Number 6, Bob Hope.
Sensational.
It's funny, you're so loyal. You're wearing your...
The 1970s and 1980s. A long, unresolved tension between two men who each considered themselves the defining figure of American entertainment comedy. Bob Hope was not simply a comedian. He was, by the time Carson's Tonight Show dominance was established, a national institution, a performer whose career spanned vaudeville, radio, film, and television, who had entertained troops in every American military conflict since World War II. He was beloved by presidents, synonymous with American optimism, and possessed of a gift for understanding exactly where power resided in Hollywood and how to remain adjacent to it at all times. For most entertainers, being booked on The Tonight Show was a privilege. For Bob Hope, being booked on anything was a transaction between equals. This fundamental difference in self-perception created a friction that neither man was particularly interested in resolving. Carson respected Hope's legacy, it would have been impossible not to. But Carson's private assessments of his contemporaries, filtered through decades of posthumous accounts, suggest that he found Hope's style dated, his politics tiresome, and his inability to adapt to the changing landscape of American comedy a kind of willful stubbornness. Hope, for his part, was not known for humility in the presence of men who were younger and currently more powerful than he was. The combination was volatile in the way that quiet rooms can be volatile, without obvious sparks, but with the constant underlying potential for ignition. Neither of them was going to yield, remembered a television executive who worked with both men during the 1970s. Johnny needed guests who would sit at his desk and let him be the host. Bob Hope needed the room to understand that Bob Hope was in it. Those two needs could not simultaneously be satisfied, and they both knew it. The result was a professional relationship characterized by public cordiality and private distance, appearances that were managed, scheduled, and conducted with a careful choreography of two superpowers conducting arms negotiations. Unlike the cleaner breaks on this list, the Hope-Carson tension never crystallized into an explicit ban. It existed instead as a mutual, unspoken agreement to keep interactions minimal and transactional. Two kings, one court, and a strictly enforced limit on how much space either would yield to the other. The Hope situation was about power refusing to accommodate more power. The next guest arrived on Carson's couch not with power to negotiate, but with chaos to distribute, and she distributed it generously. Number 7. Zsa Zsa Gabor.
Zsa Zsa Gabor.
Multiple appearances across the 1960s and 1970s, culminating in a pattern of behavior that made Gabor one of the most reliably difficult bookings in Tonight Show history. Zsa Zsa Gabor was famous for being famous, a construction that the 21st century has made commonplace but that in the 1960s was genuinely innovative. She was Hungarian, glamorous, married, and possessed of a personality so outsized that entire interviews could be consumed by the gravitational pull of her self-absorption without anyone noticing that no actual information had been exchanged. Producers loved her for her boldness and despaired of her for her unpredictability. She was the kind of guest who made great television and terrible television simultaneously, often within the same sentence. Carson's gift was control, the ability to redirect a conversation with a raised eyebrow, diffuse tension with a three-word observation, and pivot away from disaster so smoothly that audiences often didn't realize a disaster had nearly occurred. Gabor presented a specific challenge to this skill set because her chaos was not accidental. It was performative. She arrived prepared to dominate. Every conversation with Gabor was, at its core, about Gabor. The show, the host, the other guests, the audience, these were supporting actors in a production she was producing and starring in simultaneously. "Darling," Gabor reportedly told a producer before one particularly memorable taping, "I am not here to answer questions. I am here to be Zsa Zsa." She was entirely serious. Carson tolerated this with visible effort, his smile tightening almost imperceptibly in the way it did when he was managing rather than enjoying a segment, and his interviews with Gabor have a particular quality on the recording, like watching a man try to conduct a symphony while one of the instruments is playing an entirely different piece. Gabor's appearances on The Tonight Show became increasingly rare as Carson's patience with her brand of self-promotion wore thin. She never received the permanent exile that some guests on this list earned. Her cultural profile was too high, her name too bankable, but she moved steadily down the priority list until she was the kind of guest booked when a better option had fallen through. For a woman whose identity was built entirely on celebrity, this was a quietly devastating demotion. Gabor's problem was attention. Too much of it, too consistently, pointed entirely at herself. The next guest on our list had a more specific problem. He went from being a Carson favorite to a source of behind-the-scenes frustration so profound that the relationship never recovered. Number 8. David Brenner.
I don't like to go to any doctor for any. You know what the worst moment for me at a doctor's?
The late 1970s through the 1980s, as Brenner's relationship with Carson shifted from warmly enthusiastic to professionally complicated. David Brenner was, at one point, one of the most frequently booked guests in Tonight Show history, a comedian whom Carson genuinely found funny, whose observational style was perfectly calibrated for the show's format, and who received the kind of warm, extended airtime that Carson reserved for performers he was actively trying to build into stars. By his own account, Brenner appeared on the show over 150 times. He was not simply a guest, he was a Carson-endorsed comedian, which in the 1970s was the most powerful endorsement in American comedy. Careers were made with that kind of access. The trouble developed around Brenner's escalating demands. Success had made him confident, and confidence had made him, in the view of the Tonight Show production team, increasingly difficult to schedule. There were disputes about positioning, where he appeared in the lineup, how much time he received, what segments he was expected to share. The show had always operated on Carson's terms. Guests arrived grateful and left grateful. When a guest began arriving with conditions, the atmosphere changed. Johnny didn't negotiate with guests, explained someone who worked in the show's production office during that period. Guests negotiated with themselves and then accepted what Johnny offered. The moment someone started pushing back on the terms, they were already in trouble. It didn't matter how funny you were. The show wasn't about the guests. It was about the host. Brenner's appearances declined sharply following the peak of his Carson-backed visibility. He continued working. He was talented enough to sustain a career on the road and in other television contexts, but the amplification that Carson's platform provided was withdrawn. A comedian positioned for the very top tier of American comedy found himself instead navigating the more limited landscape of a career without the King's endorsement. Brenner's mistake was testing the terms of a relationship that only functioned on one set of terms. The next guest made a different kind of miscalculation. He thought Carson's sense of humor extended to being the target of a joke that went considerably further than Carson had anticipated or authorized. Number 9, Albert Brooks.
I have 7 scientists, 3 doctors that we've been employing for the last...
The early to mid-1970s. Brooks was a rising comedy star and frequent Tonight Show performer, until a series of incidents began straining his relationship with Carson's production team in ways that proved permanent. Albert Brooks in the early 1970s was one of the most genuinely original comedic minds in America. A performer whose work was so self-aware, so deliberately uncomfortable, that it made traditional stand-up comedy look like a different art form by comparison. His Tonight Show appearances were events. He arrived not with a polished 5-minute set but with elaborate conceptual pieces, fake home movies, satirical news segments, deconstructed comedy routines that were really about comedy routines. Carson was amused, bewildered, and intermittently unsure whether what he was watching was an act or an actual crisis. This ambiguity was precisely the effect Brooks was pursuing. The tension between Brooks's artistic project and the functional requirements of a late-night talk show became increasingly difficult to navigate as his bits grew more elaborate and less controllable. Brooks had a gift for creating situations that were genuinely funny but also genuinely chaotic, moments where the production team couldn't be entirely certain whether what was happening was planned or whether something had gone wrong. This uncertainty was exciting for viewers and exhausting for producers. It was the kind of comedy that required everyone in the room to trust the comedian completely, and trust, in a television production environment built on precision and control, was an expensive commodity. Albert was the most interesting problem we ever had on that show, recalled a producer from the period. He made television that nobody else could make. He also made television that nobody else could predict, control, or stop once it had started. And there were nights when those two things were the same thing and nights when they absolutely weren't. The distinction mattered enormously to a host whose authority over his own program was non-negotiable. Brooks eventually moved toward a career in film, a transition that suited his particular genius far better than the constraints of late-night television. His movies became the work for which he is most celebrated. But those close to the situation suggest that the television door narrowed before Brooks chose to walk through the film door. Carson's patience with the controlled chaos Brooks brought had a finite limit, and that limit was eventually reached. Brooks's comedy was too large for the container Carson had built. Our final guest on this list operated at an entirely different level of conflict, not as a performer who challenged Carson's show, but as the man who had sat in Carson's chair before him, and who never fully accepted the role reversal that history had imposed on them both. Number 10, Jack Paar.
Plays Walter Cronkite. So I call my mother.
1962. Jack Parr's tenure as host of The Tonight Show ended, and Johnny Carson stepped into the chair that would define American television for the next 30 years, establishing a tension between the two men that never fully dissipated. Jack Paar was not simply Carson's predecessor. He was the man who had invented what Carson would perfect. Before Paar, The Tonight Show was a variety program. Paar transformed it into something more intimate and more dangerous. A confessional, a political arena, a place where genuine emotion and genuine conflict could erupt without warning, where the host's personality was the entire point. Paar cried on air. He resigned on air. He feuded with NBC executives publicly and spectacularly, walked off the show mid-broadcast over a censor joke, and returned weeks later to an audience so massive that the clip became legendary. He made the show feel alive in ways it had never felt before. Carson, who succeeded Paar in 1962, was a different animal entirely. Where Paar was raw, Carson was polished. Where Paar made himself vulnerable, Carson remained invulnerable. Where Parr's emotions ran close to the surface, Carson's ran in deep and carefully managed channels that surfaced only on his own terms. Carson studied what Paar had built and understood, with a cold precision that characterized his entire career, which elements to keep and which to discard. The result was a show that was quieter, more controlled, more durable, and ultimately more successful than anything Paar had produced. And Paar, watching from retirement, was not entirely gracious about this outcome. Jack never completely made his peace with what Johnny had done with the show, recalled a television executive who knew both men. And by what Johnny had done, I don't mean anything negative, I mean that Johnny took Jack's creation and made it into something bigger than Jack could have imagined. And that is an incredibly difficult thing to watch happen to something you built with your hands. The professional interactions between the two men had the quality of negotiations conducted between parties who remembered when the power had been distributed differently. Parr appeared on Carson's Tonight Show on a small number of occasions, but the relationship between them was always formal in a way that suggested unresolved tension just beneath the surface. Carson's respect for Parr's place in television history was genuine. He acknowledged the debt publicly. But warmth was another matter entirely. Two men who each needed to be the most important person in the room occupied the same room only reluctantly. The tension between them was never resolved to either man's complete satisfaction, and both carried the weight of it until the end.
Parr built the throne.
Carson perfected it. And neither could ever entirely forgive the other for what that exchange had cost them. Johnny Carson hosted The Tonight Show for 30 years, conducted over 23,000 interviews, and welcomed perhaps the most extraordinary collection of entertainers, politicians, and cultural figures ever assembled on a single stage. He was seen by more Americans, more consistently, over a longer period, than any performer in the history of the medium. And yet the 10 stories we have told tonight reveal the shadow side of that extraordinary dominance, that the same qualities that made Carson the greatest host who ever lived also made him capable of a specific and devastating form of punishment. His gift was control. His curse was that control, sustained over decades and backed by absolute power, has a tendency to harden into something less forgiving than control. It hardens into judgment. Final, unappealable, permanent judgment. Carson knew, with the instinct of a man who had spent 30 years reading rooms, exactly who had crossed him and exactly how to ensure they never forgot it. He never raised his voice. He never made scenes. He simply closed the door. No contract, no lawyer, no publicist, no apology could reopen it. The king of late night understood something that every guest on this list learned too late, that in the court Johnny Carson had built, the only rule that mattered was the one he never stated out loud, that his loyalty, once broken, did not repair. It simply ended. And in the golden age of American television, when his show was the country's living room and his approval was the currency that made careers, that silence was the loudest sound in Hollywood.